Hello everyone, it's Daniel, Modern Identity Lead from Formula 5. In this video, I would like to talk about User Identity Management API, which is one of the components in Formula 5's External Identities Hub Architecture. If you didn't have chance to watch my first video from this series, I strongly recommend watching it, because in this video I explain all the concepts and components in External Identities Hub Architecture. In this specific video, we are going to talk about User Identity Management API, which is one of the components available in the External Identities Hub Architecture. So let's start. What is User Identity Management API? User Identity Management API enables managing all users' accounts in Microsoft Entra External ID tenant using Microsoft Graph API, so the programmatic access. So obviously, on one side, we have Entra portal where we can sign in as an administrator. We can, go to the user section and change some attributes on the users, create a new user, invite some users to the tenant, and so on. However, sometimes it's required to have the programmatic access. So we want to do something in our tenant through the source code. So User Identity Management API can be very helpful in case of user profile data automation and integration with other systems. So for instance, you can try to imagine that there is Salesforce or MuleSoft, and now basically those tools need access to some users' profiles from Microsoft Entra External ID tenant. So obviously, this access has to be provided in a standard way using some potential REST API and providing some responses in JSON format. But also, this access has to be secure. So this is why we created User Identity Management API in External Identities Hub Architecture, to make sure that all external tools and platforms and systems like MuleSoft, Salesforce, and any other tool can securely access user accounts in Entra External ID tenant. And obviously, when I say access, I have different operations in mind. So let's talk about this API specifically. So with User Identity Management API, we can delete user accounts. We can update user profile attributes if there is a specific need. Obviously, we can get user profile. We can get all the users in our tenant. We can also create the user. And the case is that from the automation perspective, sometimes it's crucial. So you can try to imagine the situation where user is signing into the application, and obviously authentication is done through Microsoft Entra External ID, but at some point, application needs more details about the user. So in this specific case, application can always use this User Identity Management API to grab more details about specific user or users, basically. So I think it's time to see this User Identity Management API in action, so we understand what is the purpose and how this really works. So let's do it. As I mentioned at the beginning, obviously I can access Entra Admin Center and open all users tab and modify different accounts. I can create customer accounts there and so on and so forth. However, as I mentioned, sometimes there is requirement to do stuff programmatically. So for instance, we want to grab some user accounts programmatically using the API. We want to create user account programmatically for any reason. And sometimes there is a need to delete user account in our tenant. So that's why we have User Identity Management API in our External Identities Hub Architecture. And this API underneath is utilizing Microsoft Graph API. So now let's jump into Visual Studio to see some of the details when it comes to User Identity Management API. Okay, so here is the user interface to access User Identity Management API. It's Swagger UI basically. And we can utilize this view to see all available endpoints in the User Identity Management API basically. So as we can see, we can create new user account in the Entra External ID tenant. We can delete some account using object ID from Entra External ID. We can grab user profile using user ID or email, and so on and so forth. And obviously, it's important to mention that access to this specific API is not public. This API is secure with access tokens issued by Entra External ID. So before, even accessing this API, we have to obtain the access token to successfully call one of those endpoints provided by User Identity Management API. The next thing is that here, let me show you a simple example. I can grab, for instance, information about the specific user using the email address. So if I provide my email address from Formula 5 and I click Execute button, you can see that in the response body, here is my identifier of the user. There is also my email, my first name, my last name, and the display name. And obviously, important fact is that we have full influence on the data that will be returned by this API. So initially, what we did here, we decided okay, let's provide basic profile of the user, like first name, last name, display name, email, and ID. But obviously, you can extend the attributes of the user profile that are returned by this API. So, as I mentioned, it's fully flexible. Let's jump into the code because I want to also present a few more details there. Okay, so here is External Identities Hub Architecture solution in the Visual Studio. And right now we will focus on User Identity Management API. So as we can see, here is dedicated controller with all the endpoints defined. So as we can see, for instance, there is dedicated endpoint to make it possible to create user accounts in the Entra External ID tenant programmatically. And as I mentioned, this API is not publicly available. You cannot anonymously access this API. So when it comes to access to this API, we wanted to make it flexible. So you can access this API using application permissions, so machine-to-machine communication, and you will have to obtain access token using client credentials flow, and then you will be able to call this API. And obviously, there is a role required called user manager. And this will be helpful when you want to, for instance, integrate with this API from MuleSoft or Salesforce. So if there is any external system that needs access to this API to get information about some user accounts stored in Entra External ID tenant. But also there is delegated access available. So in the context of authenticated user. This can be helpful if in the solution architecture you want to indicate some people like user managers that will be responsible for creating user accounts or deleting them for any reason. Like the architecture and the user identity management API source code is flexible. So as you can see, there is required scope. So this is used for delegated permissions if you want to access this endpoint in context of authenticated user. But also you can access this specific API using application permissions. Okay, perfect. So obviously there are all other endpoints defined here. I want to also mention one more thing. So User Identity Management API utilizes Microsoft Graph API underneath. So all the queries sent to Entra ID are sent through Microsoft Graph API. So, for instance, to grab all the users within the tenant, as you can see, here is the Graph Service client used, and we can define which properties we want to grab, and then we will return this information from the API. And the same is for other endpoints. So, for instance, to grab the user account by email async, we have to apply a specific filter and use specific query to Microsoft Graph API. So as I mentioned, in the end, we can build really flexible solution because if we need direct information about the user, obviously we can use Microsoft Entra Admin Center. If we need to programmatically create users or access their profiles or delete them in context of specific user, like user administrator, we can do it because User Identity Management API is prepared for that. And the first scenario, if there is a requirement that there is some integration required, like integration between Salesforce or MuleSoft with this User Identity Management API, it's also possible. So if there is some automation required, as I mentioned before, you can still achieve it and you can grab information about the users from Entra External ID tenant using this user identity management API. Perfect. That's it about user identity management API. If you want to learn more about External Identities Hub Architecture, I strongly recommend watching my first video and also visiting Formula 5 website. Obviously, if you have any other questions, do not hesitate to contact me directly. Email is displayed on this slide. And thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video.